Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell. Welcome virtually to the Urban Institute. Thanks for joining us. Let me do a few super quick housekeeping notes. As always, these events are being recorded, and the recording and relevant links from the panelists will be posted online after the event. You're muted, but please feel free to share questions or comments into the question box at any time. We're doing this tightly, but I'm going to try to weave in a couple of the comments into the discussion as we go. And it always helps the panelists and us to hear what questions you have and what you're thinking about, because it shapes what we do in the future. Really encourage you to join the conversation online. On Twitter, use the hashtag #live@urban. Today's event is part of the Evidence to Action series of discussions that we're holding with leading changemakers and analysts on questions emerging from the COVID crisis, and more importantly, the long overdue reckoning, maybe not more importantly, equally important, the long overdue reckoning with our nation's ongoing structural racism. Today, we will discuss a small part of the tax code with a huge potential impact on children and family poverty, the child tax credit. Many experts have called for expanding the child tax credit for years and solving problems with it reaching those who most need it. It was a key idea expansion from the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty that Urban hosted several years ago. Analysts suggest its expansion could reduce child poverty by 50% or more. But the details matter. We need to think about who benefits and how it promotes dignity, opportunity, and upward mobility. And taking a cue from the White House in its recent executive order on equity, which calls upon us to ask of various policies and policy designs, what will they do to close equity gaps in poverty, and which designs and policies would do the most there, and which ones might have the unintended effect of making equity gaps worse. President Biden has called for enhancing the credit in his American Rescue Plan, and this week, Congressional Democrats filled in the details of the Democratic proposal for expanding the credit. At the same time, Senator Romney offered an alternative approach that would consolidate several existing programs into a new expanded child allowance. I must say it's a refreshing change, almost a throwback, to have a substantive debate on policy, especially a bipartisan cross-ideological policy discussion around a shared goal, here reducing child poverty, with a shared understanding of all the other challenges to long-term outcomes that poverty creates for children. So I'm really thrilled to be joined today to discuss these alternatives by cameras magically appearing. First, Sam Hammond, the Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy at the Niskanen Center. Myra Jones-Taylor, the Chief Policy Officer at 0 to 3. And Elaine Maag, a Principal Research Associate at the Urban Institute and the Tax Policy Center, and a leading expert on the child tax credit. We're going to focus today on exploring how the credit could be expanded and enhanced to respond to families' needs amidst the pandemic and the economic crisis, and what policymakers should consider as they finalize the details of this important relief measure. And I hope we might learn a bit about some of the design challenges that might influence a long-term reform debate as well. So now with our colleagues here, I'm going to just leap right into the discussion because we only have a few minutes. Myra, can you sort of briefly set the stage for us? How are families with children, particularly for families with children, faring before the pandemic? And how has this COVID moment impacted them now? And why is the child tax credit part of the discussion about relief?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for inviting us. This is really exciting time to be having these conversations. You know, families were already struggling before the pandemic. We know that families with the youngest children, particularly those coming from low income, were blindsided by this, right? But we also know that from our most recent State of Babies Yearbook data, that prior to the pandemic, 40% of all infants and toddlers were living in families that were at 200%, below 200% of the federal poverty line, meaning that they did not have the financial resources to meet their basic needs. We also know that 1 in 5 infants and toddlers in this country, there are 11.5 million babies in this country, and 20% of them were living in poverty before the pandemic, right? So that we're already talking about crisis moment. And when we look at beyond these national figures and we disaggregate by race and ethnicity, we get an even more troubling set of figures. We see that percentages for Black, Latino, and Native American families. In each of those groups, 50% of families with young children, with babies, were in poverty or living with low income, and then we also know that prior to the pandemic, we already saw a variety of indicators that babies were not faring well. We think about food insecurity. About 14% of families were experiencing food insecurity, again, before the pandemic. 16% were living in crowded housing, right? So when you think about this, we're already talking about some pretty crisis moments. So the child tax credit is critical at this time to think about a way to alleviate some of the stress that so many families are experiencing. We know that 40% of parents with a child under 6 reported a loss of employment. Now, these are pandemic figures, or work-related, income loss. And the latest Census Household Pulse data tells us that 15% of households with children lack sufficient food compared to those with higher incomes. We also know that data also indicated that renters living with children were the hardest hit. This is harder on families to meet the basic needs when it comes to rental assistance and things like this. So, and then also I want to share that in looking at the experience of the youngest children, the Rapid EC data, which is out of the University of Oregon, sheds additional light on the experience of families with babies. So overall, food, housing, and utilities, which is interesting. Utilities were the ones that were really hard for people to pay for. And as many as 2/3 of families with babies who reported having hardship paying for basic needs identified paying for utilities as the challenge. So when we talk about having, a child tax credit or some kind of child allowance, this would significantly improve the outcomes and just the experience that families are experiencing right now with babies. So it's critical at this moment in particular if you think about brain development. And I'll get to that later.
Great. Thank you, Myra. So Elaine, I suspect most of the folks tuning in know something about the child tax credit already, but really quickly, how's it work and what kind of difference have we seen that it has made?
Sure. So the child tax credit is a tax credit that can be used to reduce your taxes by $2,000 for every child in your household under age 17. If the credit you qualify for is greater than the taxes you owe, then you can receive part of that as a tax refund. But there are restrictions on this refundable piece. The first is that you must work and earn at least $2,500 to be eligible for any amount of credit. And the maximum refund you can receive is $1,400 per child. So you can never get the full $2,000 refunded to you. Because the child tax credit is in the tax system, you have to file your tax return to actually get the credit. And if you are low income, you will not receive your credit until your tax refund arrives, which is substantially after the year in which you were low income. About 90% of all families receive some benefit from the credit, but at the Tax Policy Center, we estimate that there are 27 million children under the age of 17 who live in households that don't receive the full credit simply because their parents don't earn enough to qualify for the credit. And some of these, of course, receive no child tax credit. So while the child tax credit does a good job of reaching most families with children, some very low income children do not benefit at all, and others receive only a partial benefit, something less than the $2,000 per child. We estimate that about 25% of the lowest income families with children are not receiving a benefit from the child tax credit.
Great, thank you. So Sam, I mentioned 2 major proposals, one from Chairman Neal in House Ways and Means, which I think is closely aligned with the president's proposal, just more details. And in the Senate, a proposal by Senator Romney, which I think is closely aligned to some work and policy development that you've been doing in the Niskanen Center. So can you talk for a minute about what's in each of these 2 proposals and what is sort of the difference between the approaches?
Yeah, for sure. Starting with the Biden proposal coming from Chairman Neal, this really derives from the American Family Act, which was a proposal put out by Michael Bennet and Sherrod Brown in 2017, and then was reintroduced in 2019 with pretty unanimous Democratic support. So it has worked its way into this proposal, into the reconciliation bill. And what it proposes doing is expanding the young child credit to $3,600 and making it fully refundable, meaning to Elaine's point about your tax refund, you wouldn't anymore have to have positive earnings to receive the credit. And then they also expand the credit for older kids to $3,000. And then more ambitiously, they intend to direct the IRS to advance these credits on a monthly or quarterly basis, depending on their ability to get up and running. And so under the current plan, if the reconciliation bill passes with this in it, they're intending to have the first checks go out beginning in July. So families around the country that are in the IRS's databases will begin to see $250 to $300 per month for their kids and young kids.
And Sam, compare that to Romney?
Yeah, so Senator Romney has put forward a bill called the Family Security Act, which in some ways comes over the top of what Democrats are proposing and suggests an even larger young child benefit of $4,200 or $350 a month, and a $3,000 benefit for older kids. The big important difference administratively with what Romney has proposed is really he is proposing a kind of social security for kids. To do this to the Social Security Administration, both because the Social Security Administration knows how to do monthly payments. They do 70 million checks a month as it is. And also because the Social Security Administration will be better equipped to handle sort of mid-year adjustments. When you talk about doing this as a tax refund, tax refunds and tax returns are inherently annualized. So you can imagine some of the problems that could arise if you start sending checks to non-custodial fathers because there's been a divorce in the family in the interim. So one of the purposes of doing this, the Social Security Administration would also be to have that adaptability to changing family structure, living arrangements, and so on. And one of the other key differences is that the Neal proposal sets a phase-out rate at a pretty moderate level of income, whereas the Romney proposal retains the current child tax credits phase-out rates, which don't kick in until above $200,000 and $400,000 for single and married families. The other important distinction is the Romney proposal is fully universal on the front end. So everyone from the poor single mom to Elon Musk would be getting their monthly deposits. The key difference is that Elon Musk would have to pay back on his tax return at the end of the year.
So lots and lots of really interesting details, and we're going to come to those in a minute. Myra, I wanted to first talk to you for just a minute about, this is, I think the Romney proposal is not 1 year, as I understand it, but the Neal proposal is a sort of response to the crisis in the short term. But let's talk about this as if, for the moment, we're talking about what would be the consequence of this. And I'd ask you to talk about two things. One is there is embedded in both of these the idea that money to families matters, and that money in hand in real time to families matter. That's a big philosophical shift, if you will, from the tax credit, where we felt comfortable sometimes giving people credit on their returns. It was to give people a tax break, if you will, for having a child. This is something different. This is saying whether for everyone that having a child is something our society values, and we're making a cash payment to ensure you can support that child. Talk to me a little bit about what has brought us to this moment of that shift and what its consequence might be.
Well, I think one, obviously, the fact that we're talking about this now in the midst of COVID, it's hard to extract that from this moment. But we are really happy that this is a bipartisan issue, that we are, or at least that both parties are coming to this question. And I think fundamentally, the question at hand is, do we want to think about this as a tax credit that is based on earned income, right? And there's a sense of deservingness that goes along with that, that's inherent in that piece. Or are we talking about this as a fundamental shift about a social contract that believes that all of society benefits when children are doing well? And if we make that shift, then we're able to really think about children having rights. We're able to think about, this is not an issue of deservedness, but this is an issue about the strength of our country. This is about making sure that everybody has a fair shot at a strong opportunity. So, or, potential outcomes for their children are evened out more so than they are right now. So we're having that conversation because of these reasons, and I think it's really important, especially given what we know about brain development, about all the things that are so critical in this moment for young children's development, to making sure that their parents are not stressed out about making ends meet.
Great. So Elaine, I want to come back to one question first, but the Romney proposal essentially says Social Security, for the reasons that Sam articulated, is a better place to administer this. Again, another sort of mental shift as opposed to the IRS. Can you talk to us a little bit about the differences between a program run through one agency and the other, the strengths and weaknesses of each? And also, if you would clarify, because a number of people have asked this question, about whether or not any of those shifts would shift eligibility of undocumented children for the credit. Maybe you can do both in one question. Thanks.
Sure. So to answer that last question up front is, I don't think there's any shift in the treatment of children who don't have SSNs. They would still fall outside the sort of safety net that's being provided. And I think that's an important issue that we shouldn't lose sight of. Administratively,
Elaine, can you tell just in SSNs are?
Oh, sorry, Social Security numbers. So all citizen children have a Social Security number. And then there's other folks who get a Social Security number because they qualify for some sort of public benefit. So, but if you're here and you are undocumented, you are not going to benefit from either of these proposals.
Thank you.
When I think about the SSN, Social Security Administration versus IRS, I think policymakers have to answer this question, sort of, what can we get done today and what can we do in the future? Because we're in a moment right now that Myra has so eloquently said, families are really hurting. And so we don't have time to stand up a program that will get going in 3 years. We need to think about today. And in that, guys, I think about, well, the IRS already delivers payments to 90% of families with children. So they know where the children are and they can send a payment. They are unlikely to unintentionally reduce other benefits by changing the child tax credit. And that's because benefits for food stamps or SNAP or Tanf don't rely on what your tax refund is. And so they don't interact. That's different than how we treat payments from the Social Security Administration. Typically, payments from Social Security actually count as income. And so if you increase payments from Social Security, you might have some concerns that you would lose eligibility for other programs. I think it can be legislated around. I sort of wave it as a red flag for program designers. The IRS doesn't have experience sending monthly payments, so I think Sam is right. The Social Security knows how to do this, but I wonder in the short term if the IRS doesn't have the advantage here because they know where the kids are, where Social Security doesn't really know which child the parent lives with unless they're already participating in a Social Security program. The other thing that I worry about the long term is exactly what Sam said. When we deliver things through the tax system, it's a relatively blunt instrument. We administer things on an annual basis, and that's just not the lived experience of many children right now. There are a lot of children who are moving between different parents who might share custody. Something like 40% of children are born outside of marriage, which sort of implies that there's 2 tax units who might be supporting that child. So Social Security sort of gets this long-term edge as being able to better, move the payments with the child, something they have experience with. But today, the IRS probably has lower startup costs than Social Security would have.
So Sam, you may want to join that discussion about pros and cons or agree with it, but I also want to ask you to take on a new topic too. There's a pretty fundamental philosophical difference between the Neal approach and the Romney approach in that, as you said at the end, Romney's benefit is a universal credit. Whereas the Democrat approach has income thresholds and the eligibility phases out over time. Now you try to recoup that through the tax code, but psychologically it's a very big difference, perhaps, that we've often talked about when programs are available to everyone. Can you talk a little bit about the motivation for that? As well as I'll give you a quick rejoinder to Elaine if you want to as well.
Yeah, for sure. Just my rejoinder to Elaine is to say, these things are being put together right now through the reconciliation process. Committees are putting together their plans. If the intention is to have this be a one-year thing through the IRS and then later to consider standing up a program at the Social Security Administration, I would just suggest that this is something that we start sort of planning for right now and giving the Social Security Administration the heads up that a year from now when we're having this debate, there's a relatively smooth handoff. On the universality question, I think the motivation is twofold. The first point is, this is perhaps a little bit simplistic, but you can think of two paradigms, the kind of FDR, broad-based Social Security, broad-based social insurance paradigm, sort of constructing a platform for a robust middle class. And then there's the more Johnson, Great Society, War on Poverty paradigm, which is focused on poverty per se. And I put the Romney proposal more in the former category, in the sense that it's trying to build a bridge to the middle class and sort of planning for an economy that we want to see in the world, rather than kind of resigning ourselves to a very, very bifurcated society. The second point is that when you look at, and this is also a problem with doing this as tax benefits, when you look at across the entire life cycle, people who fall below the poverty line are not static. That is, people move in and out of poverty regularly. And when it comes to family formation and supporting families, currently the age has crept higher, but currently women in America have their first pregnancy when they're 26, and male and female earnings do not peak until your 40s and 50s. And so the opportunity to have a tax benefit for families are going to families who are already relatively mature, whereas families that are just starting out are by nature not eligible. And not because they're quote unquote poor, but just because they have relatively limited earnings because they're just out of school. So one of the purposes of a flat child allowance is to recognize that people who have limited income are not a fixed population, that they move around. And one of the social insurance benefits of having this be flat and universal is to say, well, if you fall on hard times, if you have like a cash flow problem, we're not going to claw back your benefit and treat you with the same sort of set of wraparound services that we do for people who have fallen into poverty in the richer sense of the term.
So there's a ton to unpack in that. And I hope we have a chance to come back to a couple of those questions. I think it's interesting because there's probably a number of themes there that Myra, if you looked like you were trying to jump in, you may want to respond to quickly. And then we'll go on to, I think there's some points of agreement in that and some points of disagreement. And then we'll go on to what I think are some of the known points of disagreement. Myra, you want to jump in?
I do. Sorry, there's one thing that I think is really important and we should talk about maybe moving forward is I do worry that, I completely agree, Sam, that it's important to recognize that families with young children are on the short end of the stick when it comes to earnings, and they accumulate, and so we need to adjust for that. One concern I have is, as we compare the two plans, is that other supports that are built into our social safety net, which is pretty tattered right now, would be taken to pay for, under Romney's plan, to pay for this child allowance. So I think it's important to think about what you just said, but make sure we don't undermine those existing supports. Sure, there's definitely room for reform there, for some changes. But we want to make sure that we don't take, kind of, as I was saying before, kind of rob Peter to pay Paul type of thing. So I think that's an important nuance that we should unpack at some point.
Well, and that, Myra, was going to be the question I was going to ask you next. The one key difference, I think, between the two approaches is that the Romney approach offers it, a higher credit or a higher payment allowance for children, but it offers it instead by paying for it with consolidation with other safety net programs. I suspect I'd love to give both. Myra, why don't you talk a little bit about what about that, what your response to that is, and Sam, if you want to sort of make your case for why that might make some sense.
Sure, and I do want to say that one thing that's really important about all of these policies, one, like I said, it's great that we're seeing this bipartisan support and that we're having a substantive policy conversation, right? And it's very important that we think about this in the context of young children in particular, when the timing of poverty matters. So I just want to make sure that we think about the long-term effects of it. If you actually address this early on, we are setting children up in a much better position later on. So hopefully they won't even need these supports, right? That's the goal, is so that we create economic security that moves forward, isn't just kind of an episodic thing that we're addressing. In terms of consolidation, first, I think independent analysts have shown that both of these plans really do help address poverty. But if we're thinking about the concerns that we've seen, that this would eliminate TANF, so temporary assistance for needy families, that is a challenge when we think about how many families rely on that. That said, we know that only 1 in 5 children right now, babies at least, actually have access, or sorry, 5% of families actually have access to TANF. It's woefully underfunded. It's used for many different things other than it was intended to. So we definitely want to think about how we can shore that up. But to undermine that right now, it means that we're pulling on a thread, and the consequences are pretty far reaching, because then you think about states that have categorical eligibility for other programs like LIHEAP and other things that are part of the social safety net. That if we start pulling on those, the unintended consequences could be pretty dramatic, especially in the midst of an economic crisis and a pandemic, right? We also think about the fact that this could have a disproportionate impact on families of color in particular. We want to make sure that we're not having unintended consequences there as well. And then I think the other thing that's really interesting, I would love to unpack, is thinking about what happens, the benefits differential between married families, families that are married, and single parents. And the unintended consequence of, or perhaps it's intended, to really privilege married families, but what that does to single income households could be really dramatic to young children, again, especially at a critical time in their development.
I'm going to turn to Elaine in a minute to talk about some of the equity implications that you were beginning to suggest, Myra, there. But Sam, I'm just curious, do you want to respond to some of the points about consolidation?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, just to put this in perspective, TANF is a $16.5 billion block grant to states. It's been pegged at that number since 1997. And the thing about TANF is it cuts itself every year because of inflation. And so in real terms, it's already been reduced 40% since welfare reform. On top of that, the spending within TANF has changed dramatically to the point where about only $3 billion of that block grant now goes towards cash assistance. Many states use it as a stopgap to fill their budgets and do all manner of spending that is not necessarily targeted to the poor. Additionally, because the TANF block grant froze the allocation formula that was used for AFDC, it has never been updated to account for changing populations, for changing rates of poverty. And today, on a per capita basis, on a per child basis, New York State and California receive about $500 per child from TANF, whereas a state like Texas receives about $65. A state like Idaho receives even less than that. And so a block grant like TANF is in theory supposed to be helping poor states, fiscally poor states, administer programs that they wouldn't be able to fund on their own. But as it's currently structured, it actually ends up worsening those interstate fiscal disparities, which I think also has a racial equity component, because often the poorest states are states in the South that have the highest African-American populations, and also by nature do not have the tax revenue to administer programs like this on their own. So replacing TANF with a child allowance is intrinsically per capita or per child capita, and it really would put a big dent in those regional disparities as well as in poverty more broadly. But putting that in perspective, that and the modifications that the Romney proposal makes to the earned income tax credit to remove the marriage penalty are the only things that really really concentrate on lower income groups. The rest of the pay-fors are, for instance, eliminating the SALT deduction outright, which brings in over $20 billion in revenue, and that represents a tax hike on the rich.
So Elaine, wanted to try to, it's interesting to think about the racial equity implications of the pay-fors too. I think that's a separate question. In this case, I wanted to ask you, but maybe we should be thinking about both as we look at issues, but I think there is a suggestion from this administration that we ought to be really thinking about, for each proposal that we advance, what does it do to, and does it close equity gaps? Not simply that it lowers the poverty rate, but is it lowering the poverty rate in a way that makes the disparities that Myra talked about earlier at the beginning? I think at one point talked about a number of kids under 50% of Black and brown children being in poverty. That's a sort of shocking number. So how would this proposal, either of these proposals, fare? I know we haven't done the modeling yet, although it's on the wish list, but I think you know it well enough to be able to give us a sense of what the outcomes might be.
Yeah, so both of them do a good job at reducing that equity gap. And the key to that is delivering the benefit and not conditioning it on work. So we know in this country, we have a history of not being neutral with who we hire for jobs. And so there are some groups that are disadvantaged in the labor market. And those disadvantages have just exploded during the pandemic. So in order to reduce disparities, getting rid of those work requirements, so not requiring earnings is critical. So roughly half of the families who do not get the full child tax credit because their families don't earn enough are Black and Latino. So that's a huge share of people that are excluded from the current benefits. We also looked at unemployment rates, and in the pandemic, they're just much higher for Black families and Hispanic families. And so they're going to be harmed more or not helped as much by policies that require them to work. I did want to touch just a little bit on what Sam was saying about consolidation too, though. And that is, it's not that Tanf is this program that anyone is holding up as something we would replicate and we want to fight for Tanf so bad. It's that Tanf is tied, what Myra was saying, to all these other programs. And so you can't just pull Tanf away and expect that SNAP benefits and LIHEAP benefits and all these other benefits will continue on as planned. And so I was talking to Heather Hahn, who's one of the Urban Institute experts on TANF and poverty. And she said, she would trade a child allowance for TANF if we unwound it very carefully to make sure that there weren't any unintended consequences. And when I think about Sam's last point, that the major pay-fors really do fall on higher income families, I'm left wondering, then why propose something that tangles up TANF and an EITC change where the impacts, will be felt disproportionately by families of color? Why not just rely on those higher income pay-fors instead of bringing, this interim stuff? And I should also say that even if in my mind, that child tax credit expansion might lead to some sort of child allowance, that's certainly not in the minds, as far as I can tell, of actual Democrats voting for this and, pushing the proposal forward. So I didn't want to leave an impression that they were somehow moving toward a child allowance. That's sort of in my long-term thinking.
So Sam, I'm going to give you both opportunity to engage on that, because I think, and also the conversation just now has led to the next issue I wanted to talk a little bit about, which is the historic concept we've had since welfare reform of tying benefits to work. It is the case that Senator Romney's proposal, while I think shows a very exciting opportunity for some shared commitment around bipartisan opportunity for some shared commitment around child poverty, the place where I think you have seen some less than in full enthusiasm from conservatives has been around the notion of disconnecting from work. And so I wanted to ask you to explore a little bit about that. I suspect the TANF consolidation that's here may have been in some ways related to the long-standing conservative distaste for Tanf, and that there may be some sort of balancing of equities that was in your mind. Maybe I'm misinterpreting that, but help us talk about work and its role in our understanding of supporting children.
Yeah, so the decision to consolidate Tanf, I think first of all, this is just a first iteration, so I would expect future iterations to look a little bit different. But there's really two reasons to think seriously about doing a more comprehensive reform of our family support systems rather than taking a more additive approach. The first is that because of political polarization and the broadly anti-government attitude of the conservative movement for the last 30, 40 years, I think poverty advocates have, on the left in particular, have developed a very defensive posture of all manner of programs, and rightfully so. Treat Republicans who come forward bearing gifts with suspicion, and that's problematic in the longer term, because I do think there is this question of good governance, whether the United States has a very different political system than other countries. When you have, Westminster Parliament, you can do, root and branch reforms that clean up an entire system. Whereas in the United States, not just in the poverty context, but across the board, we have this accretion and accumulation of programs. We have like 46 employment and training programs at the federal level. In the case of poverty programs, you mentioned LIHEAP. There's also one called Lifeline that will give you a $9 refundable credit to buy broadband internet. Like, we have just this immense panoply of different, very ad hoc programs that I think, on a philosophical level, if we can get to the point where we're not being so defensive and digging in our heels because of historical resistance from the right, that we can, in a good faith way, think about ways of making the entire welfare system more legible and easier to understand. And that will be a challenge, just because there are political, economic considerations here. There's probably the Lifeline Foundation or Lifeline Institute that only defends that one credit. There's always, every one of these programs will have their defenders, but I think it's the biggest salutary effect of the Romney proposal is a signal that we can begin to work together to do something more comprehensive.
So Sam, I want to make you come back to work. I'm not going to let you out of that. But before I do that, because you just opened up another critical point, I want to ask either Myra or Elaine, you guys jump in if you like, about the idea of going from a series of categorical tax credits, because we do all of our subsidy through the tax code these days, has society judging which things we think it is legitimate and appropriate for a poor family to spend their money on. We'll give you a credit for particular things. The allowance approach, I think this is one of the cross-ideological potential areas for cooperation. The allowance approach suggests that maybe we trust the protectors of low-income children to decide what their family needs most to help them in the particular moment, rather than having to navigate through so many different programs. I'm curious, Myra and Elaine, if you wanted to comment on what are the advantages and limitations of that approach?
I can start. I mean, yes, I think it's hugely important to trust parents, to trust individuals that they know best, how to spend their money. And we're seeing that. And if you look at differences between how families are spending their money, the stimulus, we've seen through the Rapid EC data, we're unpacking it a little bit, but it's interesting to look at and see that folks that have a little bit higher income are able to stash away money, whereas people who need it now are spending it on basic needs. They're spending it to pay, to pay their rent. They're spending it to buy food. That was a huge part of how they're spending their money. So we need to I think we need to trust that families know how best to spend their money. We have gotten past the days of, the welfare queen and all those incredibly demoralizing and stigmatizing and completely inaccurate ways of talking about the ways families use cash assistance, and to move away from assistance to an allowance, to think about this as a social benefit is incredibly important. So I think it's a fundamental shift that I am 100% behind. And I do want to just underscore what Elaine said. I don't think any of us think that Tanf is a flawless program, or many of these other programs are flawless. And if we were to actually think about what it could look like to put the purchasing power in the hands of families without all of these constraints, I think is important. But the devil is in the details, and I really worry about these unintended consequences. But I'm hopeful that we can get to a better place than we have been for years.
Elaine,
Yeah,
anything you want to add? Go ahead.
So I agree that moving towards cash is the right way to go. Families know they have very different problems, and we are never going to be able to legislate enough programs to meet everyone's needs. I'm from the Midwest, so transportation is a major issue. Now that I live in Arlington, Virginia, childcare is a major issue. Transportation is not so much a problem. And so we need to allow parents to be flexible with how they spend their money. And we know that you cannot pay rent with a SNAP benefit. You cannot go to the laundromat with a SNAP benefit. You need actual cash. We live in a cash society. And we also know, not just during the pandemic, when people are stressed, do they spend money that comes into their household on their children and improving long-term. We know this from years of research on the earned income tax credit as well. 25% of the families in a recent study spend that money to pay down debt, which suggests there's some liquidity constraints we need to address. They also, a large majority, spend the money on basic needs. There was an interesting study out of the Fed not too long ago where they watched tax refunds drop into communities, and then they looked at spending patterns, and people are going to Walmart, Target, the grocery store. So people are meeting needs. They're not going on a special vacation to, Hawaii. So I think that is an excellent shift. And I love to see the mindset changing towards empowering people to give them the resources to solve the problems they know they have.
All right, so this is the speed round. Sam, I'm going to give you the last word before I wrap up, to just talk for 90 seconds about work. And are we seeing, the work requirements in many of the safety net programs was a critical part of the agenda for the last administration, but this sort of emerging interest in almost a kind of libertarian interest in letting poor people decide how best to spend their money is an interesting development. Can you interpret these moves? What are we seeing here?
Yeah, the line I like to use is, we want to leave paternalism to the parent. There are two ways to promote work in welfare programs. The one way is to have a very targeted means-tested program that you then attach time limits and work requirements to, and the other approach, the more canonical approach, is just to extend benefits up the income ladder and remove the marginal disincentive to work. And so a universal child allowance takes that latter approach and says, you're not going to live off $250 a month, but the fact that this doesn't phase out, at least not until above $400,000 in income, means that a dollar earned is a dollar kept. So much of our debate in the DC policy establishment around poverty are really veterans of the 90s welfare reform debates. And one of the big reasons why something like this is happening now, 22, 25 years hence, is just the generational turnover. There's a new cohort of younger thinkers on the left and the right who are informed by different debates and different problems. And the family of 6 in Provost, Utah, does not have the same experience as the urban poor in New York City. And those differences in the lived experiences of families around the country are also channeling towards interest in policies that that make sense as one size fits all, rather than taking lessons from New York under Bloomberg and then applying them to the country.
Well, that's a extremely interesting place for us to leave it. I suspect we will see a Congressman Neal-like proposal make its way into final legislation, but this is a conversation that is going to continue, and we're really glad to have been able to preview it here. Thank you so much, Myra. I'm really grateful to you, Sam, to you, Elaine, always our Urban Institute core. Thank you all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you back in the Evidence to Action series soon. Be well.